for dark nights.
False Prophet by Joshua L. Hood. Narrated by Sariana Gregg. We all thought Sandra Mandolini hit the bottle after she saw the skinless teenager walk into her room in the middle of the night. A vision like that would have made anyone a little thirsty, so no one really blamed her. Later, we found out that she'd actually taken up brown bottle therapy a few days earlier, on the night that she'd spun her car off the road, killed that kid, and then dumped his body in the canal. Road rash and some hungry fish had done a number on the corpse of Tex Weber. It would have been damn near unidentifiable if Sandra hadn't come along with the details that linked the body to the missing teenager. Sandra claimed that Tex had told her he'd been killed in a hit and run, and that his body could be found at the bottom of the 5th Street Canal. The idiot detectives thought that Psychic Sandy had gotten her groove back. She led them to the isolated country road where the accident happened, gave specific details on his dress and description, and ultimately led them to the pump gate where poor Tex had washed up after she'd heaved his hopefully lifeless corpse into the water. She said she'd gotten the info from the ghost of Tex himself, said he'd come walking out of the shadows in the corner of her room and stood at the end of her bed telling her exactly how it happened. No, Tex didn't know who had done it. That part would remain a mystery for some months to come. Very convenient. After the body was recovered, Sandra disappeared into the Red Horn Saloon for several hours. Who could blame her, really? Sandra had nailed some readings in the past. About a year before the incident with Tex, there were a couple of lost campers, a runaway 5-year-old, and the story that started it all, a drunk homeless man crushed by an industrial garbage compactor after he'd crawled in for warmth. That was a total of 3 hits, and never you mind how many misses. A damn good record for any police psychic, and a phenomenal one for a country town made up of cowboys and preachers not prone to being open-minded in parapsychology. It was after the skinless kid that things really started taking off for Sandra. Hit after hit, Sandra was solving crimes at least once a month, and big ones too. It was almost as though the booze was high octane and her psychic powers were a sports car just out of the shop. It wasn't until much later that we figured out how Sandra had gotten so good at what she did, or why so many people were winding up dead. Part of it was our fault. All the damn stories we printed just kept encouraging her. We should have known better. The rest of it was the cops' fuck-up, though they can't really be blamed. There are so few female serial killers, after all. Now, after last summer, you're probably familiar with the name Sandra Mandolini. Her crimes kept the cable news hucksters busy for months. You may remember how she was tormented by one string of killings that she just couldn't solve. Even after all the criminals she'd helped lock away, she just couldn't nail down the needlepoint killer. The experts say that she must have committed at least 9 murders altogether. 6 as the needlepoint killer, and 3 more to cover her tracks. I may just be the local interest columnist, but I pay close attention to this town, and I tell you now that the needlepoint killer had 8 victims. Of course, Sandra never admitted to those last 2, since Sandy wasn't actually the needlepoint killer. She was always cordial to me, despite my constant skepticism of her work. I think it was because she was reaching out to one of the few people who didn't buy into her psychic crime fighter bullshit. She was reaching out to someone who might actually see her for who she was. All the same, I was surprised to get a call one night asking me to meet her at the Red Horn. At this time, she was still riding the media high of finding Tex Weber. The perp was still at large, and I had just published an opinion piece urging the population to stop getting distracted with their hometown heroine and help bring the killer to justice. I'd done a hell of a number on her in that piece. Didn't hold back what I thought of her one bit. I may have been playing up the opposition for my own purposes, I'll admit it. Sometimes it's easier to build a rep by shitting on a local celebrity than actually working hard to find the truth. But that's beside the point. On the phone, she told me that she had another vision of Tex and that she needed a drink. I got to the saloon, and it was clear that she'd beaten me there by several rounds. It was 30 minutes to last call, so I ordered light. She wasn't known for drinking at that point, and I was surprised to see her bowing before so many empties. I told my recorder that the tortured hero on a bar stool look made a great scene for print, but to make sure I didn't fall for it. By the time I made it to the bar, however, I wasn't so sure that it was an act. Something had crawled up and bit Psychic Sandy where it hurt. She was in a bad way. She spent the next half hour telling me some very convincing garbage about how she'd been woken up by the skinless boy again. He told her about the location of L.P. James, the notorious bank robber from 40 years ago who'd made a huge score 2 times over before disappearing forever. Most of the legend around L.P. James had grown up since that time. Some folks saw him as some sort of Robin Hood and liked to tell big stories about how their grandpa knew the guy. Others said that the mob had found his money and buried him in a shallow grave. There were so many short bus conspiracy nuts out there making up stories about James that I wasn't sold on Sanders' account of how he'd been shot in the leg during his last heist and managed to crawl into an old, unused culvert near some cattle rancher's pond just in time to bleed out. I did, however, admire the balls it took to try and tackle a remote viewing of a folk legend and to a reporter to boot. The booze had clearly overinflated her confidence. A very public fall from grace was coming, or so I thought. She was very matter-of-fact about the whole thing till she got to the point where she'd seen Tex. Then she downed 2 last shots and nearly shook herself off the bar stool with fright. I'd seen her at the canal when they'd dragged up Tex, and even though she didn't look as scared as she was that night, I asked her point blank why that was. Why so frazzled? Hadn't she already seen Tex's ghost once already? She hesitated and nodded non-committally. She hadn't, of course, seen anything that first time. That was a lie. The second, well, that's when things took a spooky turn. The thrill of being the one to report her crash and burn passed through my mind, but ultimately lost out to pity. Thankfully for my career, I let it go. I told her there was no story here and drove her home. That was Friday. The Sunday edition hit the stands with front page spread of Sandra Mandolini smiling through a hangover and holding up a moldy duffel bag full of L.P. James's money. My editor couldn't decide whether I should be fired or laughed out of town for giving her the write-off, but at least I didn't go negative on the story. That's when I started suspecting something else was really going on. If I'd only known then what the front page didn't show, I would have probably given up any association I'd ever again have with Sandra Mandolini. Rolled up in her purse was a bloody canal water-soaked 8th grade history report written on L.P. James. Written by one Tex Weber, 3rd period, track and field, part-time deceased. The history report didn't say where L.P. James's body was to be found, but on the back was a hastily scrawled map drawn by Sandra Mandolini, a terrified transcription scribbled in the darkness while the ghost of Tex Weber told her of unearthly things. If she wasn't already, Sandra had become an honest-to-God celebrity fortune teller that day. She didn't call me for a long time after I'd blown her off, but I followed the stories closely anyway. 2 weeks later, she found the body of an old man asphyxiated in his own home by carbon monoxide. The press would eventually claim that Tex's death had given her the taste for blood, and that the old man was just an escalation of her insanity. A tweak to the furnace. Then replace the live battery of the carbon monoxide detector with a dead one. It was all very simple in a town where no one locked their doors at night. At least they didn't before Sandra. 3 weeks later, there was a string of pet nap-ins 2 towns over. Pile of dog carcasses were found under a trestle bridge by none other than Psychic Sandy herself. That one was a matter of urgency. If Sandra's powers hadn't solved the crime, the imminent stench certainly would have. The evening show shrink said she could have gone on for a long time just killing dogs and sick old people if she'd gone undetected, but she had to get the credit while it was still hers to get, and so she escalated again and became the needlepoint killer. A week after the dogs, the needlepoint killer struck for the first time. In their haste to secure their future humiliation, the first thing the police did was to turn to Psychic Sandy for help. She played out all the tricks. Fingers on her temples, crystal on a chain, all of it. But at the end of 2 aggravating hours, came up with nothing. She said she would consult her spirit guide that night, and presumably tried, but Tex wasn't feeling like talking. 3 months later, I met Sandra again while reporting at the scene of the Needle's second murder. It was then that I coined the phrase needlepoint killer. I chose the name because it was both apt for the manner of killing and because it sounded cool. There were obvious similarities in the executions of the 2 murders, even though the victims had nothing in common. They were both immobilized by a syringe of horse tranquilizer to the back of the neck and then bled out through their carotid artery. Their stomachs and lungs were found filled with their own blood, and their pants were pulled down. That's a pretty obvious pattern. Sandra didn't do much but puke in the corner, looking very convincingly disgusted, I might add, though the smell of whiskey kinda threw off the ruse. It soon became clear that a serial killer was at large in the countryside, and our local psychic was helpless to stop him. She eventually called me again, many months and many crimes later. She said she had been seeing the ghosts of the victims whose crimes she'd solved, not to mention committed, come and go from her house at all times of the night. She'd not slept in weeks, and the booze was getting to her. She asked if she could stay with me for a few days. It was odd that she would choose me. We weren't anything like friends, and surely she had better hookups on the police force. She said that she didn't want them to see her that way. What can I say? I took pity on her. Of course, what she really meant was that Tex had told her to kill me. But how could I know that? Of all the stupid shit the press says, the thing that annoys me the most is when they call me a hero for killing Sandra Mandolini. If you ask me, the real hero's Tex Weber. Think of the grits it must take to drag yourself back from the dead to torment your killer by making her kill more people to come back and haunt her. And on top of that, making her solve the crimes she committed right in front of the authorities so that she'd never get a break from the paranoia of it all. I don't know what he had on her or what a ghost can do to someone who doesn't do what they say, but before she died, she told me that he just kept making her do worse and worse things. They weren't always murder, and the crimes he made her solve weren't always her own. Sometimes, she said, he'd give her a reading that would save someone's life, only to remind her of just how much of a hypocrite she'd become. See, Tex had it all figured out. This could go on forever. No rest for the wicked. This was about a year after Tex. Sandra had become a national sensation in the nutball community of paranormal enthusiasts. Her hot streak was still burning in every regard, except for finding the needlepoint killer. The killer was up to 6 by the newspaper's count. Later victims 7 and 8 would be found in the river, but they'd be too fucked up to be attributed to the needle. The killings were botched, and our Pride neighborhood serial killer didn't want the second-string victims on her lineup. I picked Sandra up from the Red Horn, where she'd become a fixture and a celebrity, though in any other life she would have just been a corner post at the bar. I drank with her for a short time, but saved my wits for the drive home. On the way there, she showed me Tex's history report. She said the blood was on it when he handed it to her that first night because he didn't have any skin. I reminded her that the revelation about L.P. James came from the second encounter with the dead boy and not the first. She didn't say anything. I think she came close to confessing, telling me and the world that she'd made up the first sighting to cover her ass, and that when Tex actually showed up, he had a lot more on his mind than closure. Every time she looked like she would spill the beans, though, she started glancing around like someone who wasn't me was watching her. Once, a glance into the rearview mirror spooked and shut her up for almost 5 minutes straight. It took a long draw from a dented flask to get her feet back under her. I don't know what or who she saw back there, but by that time, the list of possibilities was pretty long. Wasn't until I was stabbing her repeatedly that she choked out her confession. That night, I heard her talking to someone. I'd offered her my room, but she said she wanted to be in the living room where it was less creepy. More doors, a TV, big windows for the street lamps to shine in. It didn't matter about that last part, though, because she kept the lights on all night long. She'd offered to sleep in bed with me, and I realized just how big of a wreck she'd become when I broke it to her that I don't sleep with women, and she almost cried. She'd clearly become desperate. When the voices first started, I thought that she just turned the TV on. I couldn't make out what they said and tried to ignore them. Then it sounded like there was a dog barking in the living room. I was startled awake. It took some time before I realized why the sound disturbed me so much. It wasn't a normal bark. It was angry. But that wasn't all. It sounded strangely distant, like a bark in a tin can. But that somehow cut across the grain of what my ears might call normal hearing. It's hard to explain. I started down the hall to see who was in my living room, but froze before I rounded the corner. It was a full fucking house. There was the old man who she'd asphyxiated, a college student who'd fallen off a balcony, a pile of dead dogs, and, of course, good old Tex Weber, all standing weirdly around Psychic Sandy, who was curled into a praying ball in the middle of my now piss-stained couch. The crowd kind of faded in and out of view. The lights in the living room didn't do nearly enough to illuminate them as they circled rhythmically like kids playing Ring Around the Rosie about the couch. To say I saw them is less correct than to say I felt them through my eyes. In fact, I may not have seen anything at all now that I think back. Maybe the Red Horn has just been doping up their hooch. Maybe I only saw a roofed-up hallucination of what I expected to see after listening to Sandra wax paranoid on a car ride down a lonely stretch of highway in the middle of the night. I don't know, but suddenly I was a believer. The victims of the needlepoint killer weren't there, but of course I know why. I grew anxious and looked around with the sudden fear that I might see those 8 pantsless corpses parading somewhere around in my house, too. They weren't there. I guess they just lacked incentive, or a ringleader like Tex, or maybe they just didn't know who killed them. I was very careful, after all. Probably it was because of Tex that Sandra's victims had come back to her. He was an energetic kid in the prime of his life, a natural leader, and apparently he was a little fucked up in the head, too. When I chose my victims, I chose ones that would have very little fight in them. I guess I did myself a favor there, because they still haven't shown up. The first thing I did was wait for the ghosts to go away. It took until about dawn, but eventually they faded for good. Sandra hadn't seen that I saw, and she began telling me that she knew where another killing was going to take place. Then she started apologizing and telling me that she had to do it, and she'd make it quick. I told her to shut the fuck up. Then I called her a few names that even serial killers don't like to spread around and slapped her hard across the face. She slapped back, which was enough to get a good fight started. After the living room was convincingly smashed up, I used a butcher knife and went about ending her little reign of terror. She crumpled into a sobbing pile of pain and apologies, spilling all her dark secrets, maybe in hope that a last-minute confession might save her soul or something. She professed over and over that she hadn't done the needlepoint killings, though. Not her. It wasn't her. I told her I knew that, but I don't think she got it. I had no desire to confess myself, so I didn't clarify and just continued with my work. It was not neat. Had to make it look like I was struggling. About halfway through the fight, I looked up and saw Tex in the corner. He was standing in a shadow, looking all sorts of pissed off. His rage was palpable in the room. It was eerie. I got the strong impression that he couldn't do jack about what I was doing because I never did anything to him. His rage was there, but it was somehow not able to get to me. I could tell that Sandra felt it hard, though. She fought like a devil when she saw Tex scowling from the corner. Oh, how she fought. It really sold the act I'd been putting on for the police a half hour later. Damn near gouged out my left eye. When I was done with Sandra, I got all my surgical tubing and syringes and splayed them out on the floor next to her purse. I put Tex's history report half under the couch and then injected myself with a few drops of horse sedative from a syringe. I had to rip the needle out halfway through, like I'd caught her in the act. It hurt like hell until the drugs started kicking in. It was potent stuff. A mostly unintelligible 911 call later, and the whole scene fell into place. I told them of how she confessed everything, throwing in a little white lie by adding the needlepoint killings to the mix, though I left out the bit about the 2 bodies in the river. That was my shame. Sure enough, the evidence indicting Sandra was all over the place. The police just hadn't been looking hard enough. They'd gotten lazy with Psychic Sandy on the case and were in a hurry to put their reps back together. 1 week later, I was free from the hospital. A hero. I guess in a way Tex did me a favor. He showed me that I was one bad killing away from ending up as a shriveled husk of a booze hound pissing myself on a stranger's couch. I knew I had to stop, even though I didn't want to. I keep reminding myself that I want less to be haunted by some kid full of bad voodoo than to go about my work. I still don't know what brought Tex back or how he did what he did, but the kid was good at it. I kind of admire him for that. So now, I take it one step at a time. It's getting easier. Mostly. Maybe if I kick the murder habit, I'll quit smoking next. Now I hear that one's real tough. I don't fear that the truth will be discovered anymore. A long time has passed, and Sandy made a good patsy. There are conspiracies, of course, but I'm not afraid of those. After all, no one will suspect me. There really are so few female serial killers.